The human's hand was absurdly warm, a steady, pulsing heat that felt like a localized sun against Vesper's cooling skin. She watched the way his fingers calloused, stained with engine oil, and entirely too soft wrapped around her own. He wasn't trying to extract data or measure her vitals for the hegemony's efficiency logs. He was just holding on. To the hegemony, this was the ultimate inefficiency, a wasted expenditure of caloric energy. To Vesper, staring up at the sky didn't darken, it bruised. A deep, sickly violet bled across the horizon of Obsidian Reach as the hegemony's obsidian-hulled carriers broke orbit. They didn't come with a warning. They came with the cold, rhythmic efficiency of a machine scrubbing a stain from a floor. Vesper felt the familiar hum of their ion engines in her marrow, a vibration that used to mean safety, but now felt like a funeral dirge. Beside her, Elias didn't look at the sky. He looked at the diagnostic screen of a repurposed mining drone, his thumb tracing the edge of the glass. He was calm in a way that defied every tactical manual Vesper had ever studied. To the hegemony, he was a variable to be erased. To Vesper, he was the heartbeat of a world that refused to go quiet. She took the control link from his grease-stained hand. Their skin met, and that spark, that localized sun returned. It turned out that Kalis had been wrong about everything. He thought empathy was a leak in the system, a loss of pressure. He never understood that when you care about the person standing next to you, you don't fight for a throne. You fight for a name. You fight for the smell of dried fruit and the way the light hits a dusty floor at noon. Vesper closed her eyes, letting her consciousness slip into the mesh of the mining drones scattered across the ridge. Hundreds of them. They weren't warships. They were scavengers built to pull wealth from rock. But as the first hegemony dropships descended, she didn't command them to attack. She commanded them to synchronize. The drones rose like a shimmering curtain of steel. They didn't move in the rigid geometric patterns of the Zoltec military. They moved with the frantic, beautiful unpredictability of a Terran hive. They didn't aim for the hulls. They aimed for the sensors, the thrusters, the very things the hegemony relied on for its cold precision. Empathy is a tactical advantage, not a biological error, Vesper whispered into the comms, knowing Kalis would be listening on the command frequency. You can't predict a pilot who values his wingman more than his own life. You can't simulate the spine of someone who has already lost everything and decided to build a home anyway. The dropships faltered. The hegemony pilots, trained for sterile, predictable combat, couldn't account for the sheer, messy desperation of the Terran defense. A mining drone jammed its drill into a stabilizer. Another vented its cooling gas into an engine intake. It was chaotic. It was loud. It was entirely human. One by one, the violet lights in the sky began to retreat. The hegemony didn't understand defeat. Only resource management in the Obsidian Reach had suddenly become too expensive to purge. As the last carrier blinked out of the atmosphere, leaving only the cold stars behind, Elias stepped up beside her. He didn't cheer. He just leaned his shoulder against hers, a heavy, grounding weight. Vesper looked down at her hands, Zoltec hands, built for cold buttons and steel levers, and saw they were shaking. Elias reached out, covering her hand with his. Truth is, the hegemony didn't just lose a moon today, they lost the myth of their own perfection. Word would spread. Other worlds, other species, would hear about the scavenger moon that didn't break. They would look at their own scars and see them for what they really were. Vesper looked at Elias, at the map of refusals written on his skin, and finally understood. The rebellion hadn't started with the drones. It had started in a small, cramped hut, with a cup of warm liquid and a hand that didn't let go. The stars were still there, indifferent and vast, but for the first time in her life, Vesper wasn't looking at the stars. She was looking at the person beside her, and that was more than enough. Would you like me to generate a cinematic image of the curtain of steel mining drones defending Obsidian Reach? The low, corrugated ceiling of a scavenger's hut on Obsidian Reach, it felt like the only thing keeping her atoms from drifting apart. Overlord Kalis had been very clear before he stripped her of her rank and her flight husk. He had stood on the black dais of the high spire, his eyes like two dead stars. He called her empathy a biological error. He told her that to feel the vibration of a subordinate's fear was a crack in the armor of the Zoltec state, and so he broke her, not with a blade, but by venting her escape pod into the gravity well of a dead moon. The descent had been a screaming blur of atmospheric friction and the smell of scorched circuitry. The pod hit the regolith of Obsidian Reach with a violence that should have ended her story. But the stars don't care about your throne, only your spine. And Vesper's spine had remained intact through the impact. She remembered the silence that followed, a thin, freezing silence that was eventually broken by the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on metal. They were Terrans, scavengers, a species the hegemony archives described as persistent vermin with a high tolerance for chaos. Vesper had spent cycles analyzing their tactical weaknesses from the safety of a command cruiser. She knew their anatomy was fragile, their technology a patchwork of stolen dreams and salvaged junk. Yet, when they pulled her from the wreckage, they didn't strip her for parts. A man named Elias had carried her. He didn't use a grav stretcher. He used his own muscles, his breath coming in ragged huffs that mirrored the rhythm of her own failing lungs. In the weeks that followed, the small, cramped hut became her entire world. It smelled of recycled oxygen and something sweet dried fruit, perhaps. She watched them from her cot. They laughed when the power flickered. They shared rations when the supply ships were late. Truth is, they were doing the one thing the hegemony deemed impossible. They were building a home, and Vesper began to realize that building a home is the loudest form of defiance in a galaxy that wants you dead. One evening, as Elias cleaned the jagged laceration along her primary cooling vent, Vesper reached out. It was a reflex, a biological sin she no longer tried to suppress. She traced the white raised line of an old burn on his forearm. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from his work. "Scars are maps of where we refuse to break," he murmured, his voice a low hum that vibrated in Vesper's chest. She felt a strange constriction in her secondary heart. It wasn't a malfunction. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that Kalis was wrong. Empathy wasn't a tactical error. It was a bridge. And as the distant flash of a hegemony scout ship flickered in the night sky above the Reach, Vesper knew the bridge was the only thing that would help them survive the fire to come.